Hi everyone, welcome to Daily IELTS English, where I'll show you the techniques that I like to teach my students to help them get high scores on their IELTS speaking test. This is a weekend episode, so I'm going to take a little bit of a long look into one of the techniques that I use. Today, we're looking at how to talk about problem and solution relationships. So in the IELTS speaking and writing test, you sometimes will get questions that talk about problems and solutions to those problems. Now, one of the most important things that people don't think about with their speaking and writing is the part of the test that is task achievement. This is the part of the test that isn't looking at your grammar, vocab, and pronunciation. It's looking at how well you answer the question. It's looking at your ability to explain your ideas carefully. They have criteria like fully develop the topic or fully develop their answer. And this is where a lot of IELTS students and also a lot of IELTS teachers get a little bit mixed up. They focus on grammar and vocab, and those are important. But what's really important to remember is that if you don't have ideas, if you don't have a way of organizing your ideas, it's really hard to use the higher level complex grammar. It's really hard to use vocabulary that's less common. And more importantly, it's hard to learn it. You're not going to improve your vocab and grammar by studying. You're going to improve your vocab and grammar by improving the way you organize your ideas and think about things, because then it will be easier to remember. I would just like to point out that yes, these videos all deal with techniques for organizing ideas, because if you focus on answering the questions carefully, if you focus on task achievement, if you focus on fully extending the idea, the grammar and vocab will come a lot faster than if you just focus on the grammar. So today we're looking at problem-solution relationships, and we're focusing on how to give answers about solutions. So I've written down a few questions here. Two of them are quite generic. What can be done to improve people's overall health? That's fairly standard question. Or what can be done to manage some of the issues related to climate change? So these are questions that are saying, what are the solutions? What can people do? What can governments do? What can be done? Today's IELTS test, I think the questions get a bit more complicated. Another one might be about video game addiction. So people who play too many video games. They might ask you, what are the effects of this? And what are some possible solutions? The secret to talking about these three things, and not just talking about them, but thinking about them, there are three key ideas, two really important ones, and then a third sometimes. If you want to talk about solutions to the majority of problems they will ask you about in the IELTS test, it is regulations, so law, government action, education, and sometimes, the third one, sometimes is technology. So if you talk about regulation, that can push you towards ideas about incentivizing. So giving people a reason to do something. Government regulations can incentivize good or bad behavior. If you're solving a problem, it's probably good behavior. You can encourage people to, all right? So if you have the right laws, it will encourage people to make certain decisions. Government regulation can help raise awareness. Government regulation can launch campaigns to solve problems. That connects to the other point, which is education. And it's quite similar. Education can raise awareness. Education can encourage people. So that's the kind of vocab that you're going to use if you're thinking about regulations and education. The third idea, and it's not always as effective, is technology. Technology can solve a lot of problems. That might be through developing apps that can help you make decisions. Develop apps that can track your food intake or track your exercise. Technology can provide access to resources or information. So all of that vocabulary, provide access to resources, provide access to information, incentivize people to make better choices, incentivize people to take care of their health. That's the kind of vocabulary that's going to get you the higher score. And even if you're doing your test and you say governments can create laws that incentivize people to take better care of their health, that can get you that 6.5 or 7. That is a very specific piece of language for a specific idea. And if you want to get a higher score, if you're aiming for an 8 or a 9, all you're doing is then improving your vocabulary. I was using fairly basic vocabulary to express a very specific idea. So even getting a 7, you don't have to have all this elaborate and, artistic and stylish language. For a 7, you've got very, very good basics and sometimes more specific vocabulary. But incentivize, raise awareness, that's good enough. So let's just take a look at some of these questions that I talked about earlier. Starting with a somewhat simpler one, I've just made some notes here on the question, what can be done to improve people's overall health? Let's start with regulation. Regulation can put taxes on sugary food, or it can put taxes on junk food. That will disincentivize people from consuming it, or it will incentivize people shopping for healthier food. It will incentivize people making better food choices. You can ban junk food from schools. And again, there's another word, ban, prohibit. That's the kind of vocab that can get you the higher score, but it's only something that you are going to say if you're thinking about government regulations. Governments can provide tax incentives for gym memberships or sports club memberships or martial arts memberships. They can provide tax incentives for cooking classes. So they can, if you take a class in cooking or if you're going to the gym, maybe you can claim that on your taxes depending on tax systems in your country, or you can maybe get a refund. Or again, governments can even lower the cost of gym memberships. They can provide money to those companies that are opening and teaching healthy activities. Now, here's the thing. Even if you don't agree with me, even if you're very conservative or very libertarian, you might disagree with my idea, but I'm still providing possible answers. I could even say, here are some ideas, and then explain why I don't like them. But I've now used the vocabulary, incentivize, provide incentives, put a tax on, or prohibit, or ban. I've now used that vocab to talk about regulation. I can also talk about education. And that connects a little bit with regulation. Governments can provide schools with higher budgets. They can provide schools with budgets for healthy school lunches. Schools can raise awareness. And again, then education doesn't even have to just be schools. Governments can launch campaigns to raise awareness about the risks of poor diet. They can launch campaigns using TV commercials, posters to raise awareness. And again, if you agree or disagree, it's still an idea that you can talk about. Technology, again, this one gets a bit tougher. You can possibly create apps that can track food intake. You can create apps that can determine how much physical activity you've had in a day. Another possibility there might be developing foods that are healthier, so perhaps a sweetener, something that provides sweetness to food that is somehow lower in calories. Again, it gets into weird ideas, but if you're thinking about how regulation, education, and technology can solve problems, then when you're reading the newspaper, when you're listening to the radio, you can take those ideas and fit them into your way of thinking, into your way of always looking for ways that regulation, education, and technology can solve problems. The second question was, what can be done to manage some of the issues related to climate change? Again, I can use some of that same vocabulary. Governments can use regulations. They can create laws to provide incentives for green companies. They can provide incentives for individuals to use solar energy instead of being on the electrical grid. Governments can improve public transport. They can incentivize people to take public transport. They can provide funding, and that's another word that's come up a few times. Another solution would be education. So you can raise awareness about recycling. You can raise awareness about the importance of consuming less or purchasing items with minimal packaging. Again, all of these ideas come just because I think about how can we educate people. This one works really well with technology. Governments can invest in green technology such as solar or wind or technology to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, we've talked a little bit about what I would say are the kind of basic problem solutions that come up. This other question here about the negative effects of video game addiction. This one was admittedly hard for me, but I was able to actually make suggestions, but I was also able to say why it might not work. So again, video games, these are companies that, they make money the more you play their video games. So it's really a tough one to solve. So I think about regulation. I don't think you can regulate video games. It's really difficult to. You could possibly incentivize video game companies to find solutions. You can't force these companies to, kick young people off their platforms if they're playing too much. But governments can incentivize exercise, perhaps through more physical activity at schools. Possibly schools or even governments could ban devices during school lunch or during school breaks. I don't know if that's the best solution. I don't know if that would work. I imagine a lot of parents and young people would reject that idea, but it's something to explore. So even here, if I'm not totally sure what my answer is, if I have a way of thinking, I can at least make some suggestions and then maybe say why it won't work. For education, provide education for parents about the risks and dangers of video game addiction, and provide resources for parents if they need help. If their child gets addicted to video games, there needs to be something that the parents can get a hold of, or support that they can get from maybe nonprofit groups to help deal with these problems. Again, that's a tricky one. People are generally going to have to be responsible for their own behavior. So as long as the government or schools can provide resources when the person makes that choice, then that's really all they can do. So even there, although I struggle to answer the question, I can still look at some possible ways as long as I think about those three things: education, regulation, and technology. Thanks for watching. Remember, the idea with this is it's ideas first. If you focus on organizing your ideas, then the vocab and grammar come more easily. And more importantly, when you're reading in English, when you're listening to the radio in English, your brain will start to look for these ideas, and it's going to make it easier for you to remember the vocabulary, to remember the grammatical structures. I use this technique when I'm learning languages. My students do their best to use this technique. A lot of them do it very well. I've seen a lot of people really get those scores quite high using these techniques. Anyway, that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember, language is a habit. So all of these techniques we looked at here, these are things you need to practice. If you've got your test tomorrow, this might help you. If you've got a few months, and it looks like a lot of us have time right now, practice it for a couple of months and your results will be outstanding. Please tell me about them here. We also had those 3 questions. What do you think? How do we solve problems like climate change, like video game addiction? Put your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read them, and have a good day.